Hi, this is Abdul Bharti, and we are here at the Spinnaker Summit in San Diego. And today we have with us Rosalind Benoit. You are open source evangelist at Armorys. First of all, thanks for being on the show. I'm curious about your own journey because before we started recording, you're mentioning about your dad being a Unix guy, and then he would not let you use computers. So I want to understand your journey. When you came in contact, or when were you exposed to open source? Why you got excited about it?
I mean, it really did start when I was very young, kind of the days of the World Wide Web, right? And I just, in order to have a computer and use a computer in my home, I needed to be comfortable. Usually it was Fedora, like some kind of Red Hat Linux flavor that we would use, but I had to be comfortable, maintaining the computer on my own. Installing the software, and also eventually building it from hardware, or else I didn't have much to work with. So if I wanted to, look at websites or whatever, I had to figure out how to do it on my own. And I'm really grateful to my dad for kind of laying that foundation for me. And then I kind of set it aside, or it wasn't something that I spent a lot of time doing for fun, because I did other stuff. I had other things that I was interested in. Definitely in high school, I went to the Illinois Math and Science Academy in the Chicago area, and at one point there were we lived in dorms. It was a boarding school, and there was there were some fellows in my residence hall who found out by sniffing the local network, that I was running Linux, and so they started spamming me and sending me these weird, installing these bots on my computer. And so we would do this war where, they would install something weird and start sending me messages, and then I would block it, and then they would find another way in, and it was kind of fun. And one of those gentlemen actually ended up asking me to the prom that year. So it was kind of a silly romance story. Geek romance story. But anyway, after that, I got a degree in English literature and Japanese. So I really just I didn't close the book on my open source passion, but it was just it was like a personal hobby thing, and I didn't think of it as my career. And I think the point where I started thinking about really working in tech, it wasn't until I worked at a press, and they were sending out email marketing, and they were using MailChimp or something. And I was like, wow, your templates really suck. They're not very good. I think I could do better myself. And so I started Googling and just kind of learned HTML and CSS. And from there, I sort of traversed the stack, and I found myself realizing I know all these commands. I have a Unix background. I know how to use this tool set. So it seems like that skill's really valuable here. And it sort of went from there. And then eventually I worked as a sysadmin, and I was most recently at Puppet. So that was my first open source company that I worked for. And now I'm thrilled to have found Armorys. But what's great about what I've found at Armorys is I basically have the best job in the world, in that I'm exclusively devoted to growing and supporting the community around Spinnaker. And I've been given very specific instructions by everyone at Armorys. Not that actually people at Armorys don't give you specific instructions, which is what's great about working there. But I've been given a blessing to exclusively focus on growing Spinnaker adoption and growing the community and making it a vibrant place. So it's really cool to have that opportunity to exclusively be thinking about the open source side of things at a commercial open source company, if that makes sense.
Armorys already does a lot of open source. You consume open source, you contribute to open source.
The plugin framework.
Everything is there.
Yeah.
So what value do you bring to this community where they are already engaged?
Yeah. So we say they're already engaged, and it's true that we do have an amazing community that already, this weekend I've grown to love, and I've met so many people in the community. This is a great time to join the company and join the community. But I would say, as far as do we have the healthy and robust and widespread community that we want to have in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, I would argue, no, we don't. Not like our community now is bad, but we're not there yet. And part of that is that we have some really important, incredible organizations that have sponsored and fostered Spinnaker. And so we want to continue to leverage that, and we want to continue to keep those people and those companies at the center of our world. But at the same time, as more and more companies start adopting Spinnaker and participating in the community, we want there to be opportunities for that to happen more. We want there to, again, that critical mass to build. So as a new person coming into the Spinnaker community now, I think it can be kind of intimidating. I think that, if you don't work for Google, you don't work for Netflix, or you don't work for Armory, you may not feel super confident submitting your first PR. And I think that you may not know where to go. You may not understand the value of what you have to offer. And I think one of the things we found, especially reflecting on the keynote that we did this morning, everybody was kind of getting up and we had a bunch of different companies participating, and everyone has been getting up and telling the same story about Spinnaker adoption. Why did we move from these brittle paths to production into doing continuous delivery with Spinnaker? And everybody has the same pain. Everybody has the same. And so essentially, like, and I'm very much a meta-analysis person. So I guess like one of my essential goals in the Spinnaker community is to help people feel that they're not alone. So you may not work for Google, you may not work for Netflix, you may not be a Spinnaker wizard right now, but you're not alone. Everyone has been or is still in your shoes and is still working to continue to build this product. So I think like that's kind of my high level look on it, is we want to give people opportunities to learn, opportunities to feel connected to the community, and also opportunities to engage. So one of the things that we're going to do this upcoming in March is our first official open source hackathon for Spinnaker. And that's something that everybody has wanted to do. And there have definitely been really great contributions to open source Spinnaker, but there's never been an organized effort to say, hey, look, we have these 5 goals. Let's break those down into micro stories and let's point some teams at it. Let's make sure that we have different echelons of experience that will benefit from participating in this hackathon. And now here are all the resources that you need. This is how you communicate it with us, and go. I just said a lot of things. That's actually a lot of work to set all of that up. And I can't do it alone. But what I can do is motivate people in the community and kind of organize people in the community to get excited about doing that, to get excited about volunteering their time, and get companies excited about volunteering their time to really build this thing and continue to, what I should think of a sailing metaphor to say, but how can we make this thing go together? And I think I have the right kind of energy to motivate people and get them to want to participate. And so that's kind of my goal, is to just like apply that to the Spinnaker community to get it, to rev it up,
Right. If you look at Armory, you are a vendor, right? You help it. So you also come across a lot of customers who are using Armory, but they are paying for it, right? But when you interact with their developers, sometimes, they're smart people, they solve some problem internally that they come across. They don't always rely on a vendor.
Yeah.
So they can also become a critical part of the community. So do you also work with the developers of your customers so that you can, as you earlier mentioned, just to motivate them or help them to just go out and put the patch out, or become a member of the community, because that's how the community grows?
Absolutely. So far I've only committed to the Spinnaker.io website. So I haven't personally committed to the Spinnaker code base at all, but that's certainly one of my goals for the next, as I start to get into the community and become less of a noob. I'm going to look for what is that first low-hanging fruit thing that I can tackle. And a lot of that, as you said, I think comes from working with customers and understanding their problems and seeing their solutions, and then saying, hey, what do you think about open sourcing this? And maybe before they're ready to open source it, what do you think about telling your story and getting feedback on it? And then that can lead down the garden path to working with the community to open source something that's maybe too big to do on their own. So I think that's kind of the key for me. Yeah.
What kind of culture is there internally at Armory when it comes to open source?
When it comes to open source, I think that that's really evolved a lot So I'm coming in at a point in time when Armory has just done an incredible amount of work for open source Spinnaker in the last year. And we have, Ethan Rogers, who was just added to the TOC. And he's been working a lot with the community and really focusing primarily on open source and where we can contribute there. So I would say right now, growing open source and prioritizing open source features and donating our engineering time to making the open source product viable commercially, I think that's our top priority, because what Armory understands really well, and what I've had so many people at Armory already tell me this in a million different ways, is like, if open source Spinnaker doesn't succeed, there's no point in us doing what we're doing. Like, there's no reason for Armory to even exist if open source Spinnaker isn't thriving. So I would say everybody at Armory is totally on board and aligned behind, like, that's our goal, is make open source Spinnaker thrive. And if there are bumps along the road in figuring out what it means for us to thrive while open source Spinnaker thrives, like, we'll figure those out as we go. But we know that there's no point in even trying to solve our own problems if we can't solve enough problems for the Spinnaker community to make the project a huge success.
I'll go back to the early days when you started with Fedora and all those things. Actually, Fedora Core was also my first distribution.
Yeah.
Then I moved. Then
you try all of them.
Recently, I have been. No, I have never been a distro hopper. Because I use it for my work. Yeah. But then I moved to Mac because I do film production, and Mac is where. So latest was OpenSUSE Tumbleweed and Arch Linux.
Okay.
And if you're an Arch Linux user, you will tell everybody that you use Arch Linux. That's the joke there. So if you look at the early days of Linux and open source, there was that you had to go out and educate people why you should use open source. What is the value of open source?
Yeah.
In today's world, everybody is using open source, but the problem still remains. They use open source as the code base, but they do not understand the open source culture. They don't understand the open source community. They don't understand the importance of contributing back, how to become good open source citizen. So how do you see this as an open source evangelist when you come across a lot of companies? They do consume open source, they have repository, but internally they work like a proprietary company.
I think you're absolutely right about that, and I think that's a keen observation on your part. And I really think that a lot of that has to do with, I don't want to say culture of fear, because that's speaking a little too strongly, but I think that there is this, I think you're right that people don't understand that they should be giving back to the community. That's true. But I also think, honestly, that a lot of people are afraid to contribute to the open source community. And I think, like, one of the things that I associate with open source culture, good and bad, just having a lot of early memories of this, is like not wanting to look stupid, right? Like, we don't want to look like we don't know what we're talking about. So, and I can't remember what the article was that I read about this a few weeks ago, but like a point that you can make about that, and you see this happen. So people will, you'll publish your code, put it out there, people will start using it, and you'll ask for feedback, and you'll be asking for feedback for months maybe, and then, months go by, you think your code's working, you're like, oh, I see people are pulling it, people are using it, they're talking about it. And then a few months later, you find out, like, there's this critical bug that meant that probably the vast majority of people using it were never able to actually implement the tool and get it off the ground and use it. But everyone using the tool just assumed that it must have been their configuration. It must have been, their some hardware specifics, or they weren't smart enough, or they weren't dedicated enough to get it to work. And so I think that, like, there's this culture of being afraid to put yourself out there and look like you're the least educated person in the room, or the least hackery person in the room, or however you want to think about it, like that. And so I think that that's something that I really personally, I have a personal struggle with that as an open source evangelist. And now that I am in this position to work with this very successful open source community, that's something that I want to kind of start to chip away at, because I'm the person who is willing to come into the room and say, hey, what's up with this? Why doesn't this work? I mean, I try to be that person, you know, and I'm also have a past career as an educator. And as a teacher, when you're running the classroom, if you can't get people to ask questions and you can't get people to engage in your class, like, that's the worst thing, right? The most absolute worst thing is when you hear crickets, right? Especially, you know, you're teaching math and you understand, like, if people are not telling you that they're not getting it, they're probably not getting it, but they're not talking to you about it and they don't trust you enough. So I think that's really, it's really about trust, and it's about overcoming that fear. Because as a programmer, you know, like, the only way to be a good programmer is to be able to confront your fear and work through it, right? Because you know, anytime you're working on a feature, or you're maybe trying to set up an environment and get something to work in this new environment, you have to try it a gazillion times in order to get it to work. And you have to work through every error, and you have to look at the stack trace and figure it out. And every time you get discouraged while you're doing that, it takes longer and longer for you to get it. And then sometimes, you know, if you give up, you're never going to figure it out. So you have to have the ability to just take a breath and say, you know, okay, I'm not afraid to move on to the next error. I don't think that I'm fixing it. I'm just moving to the next error, and I'm going to learn more. So kind of approaching it from that mindset of the freedom to try, and the freedom to ask, and the freedom to be wrong, and the freedom to not know. Like, it's okay to not know. I feel like I really want to get that across, and I really think that's something that the open source community has been missing, and I think that's at the root of part of the problem that you're talking about. Yeah.
Awesome. And you hit the nail on the head. Only thing that I also feel is that, in addition to that, is also that they are just not exposed to the culture.
That's also true.
Internally, they have always. I feel that, you know, developers, they might have their own GitHub repositories and page accounts, but internally they just, you know, because the culture within the company, middle management is all about kind of rewarding, you know, your achievement, not achievement as a team.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
So they work on open source projects in a very proprietary manner.
Absolutely.
So I think that's where I think your role comes into play, where more and more companies should have open source evangelists who can actually, you know, bring that culture to the company. I mean, Armorys is an exception because Armorys is a kind of open source company in a way, but a lot of companies do need. And then also, when you work with your customers, you can also help them in it, because it's a big issue with education.
Right.
You know, it's all about that.
Right.
Not just because you're a teacher, but, you know, it's also education that they just don't know also sometimes.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's another thing that I'm going to be doing. I consider that to be another of my huge responsibilities. And we have other great solutions architects who are already focusing on this some at Armory, but it's a lot of work. We really need to have a better asynchronous training framework, and have some asynchronous training opportunities for people in the Spinnaker community to learn how to solve their problems, because that's another way to help people feel supported, understand that they're not alone, and again, like you said, expose them. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's really all about culture. It's about culture, and you can look at it from a bunch of different standpoints, from exposure to this mentality that I'm talking about, but really, like, what we need to do to grow this community and make an open source project succeed is to develop a strong culture of collaboration and community and openness and trust. That's really what it's all about. Got it?
So Rosalind, thanks a lot for, you know, sitting down and talking to me about the whole open source movement that you are doing within Armory and within the community. Good luck with that, and of course, you know, we are always here to help you with your messaging, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
I actually look forward to seeing and talking to you again in future.
Me too, and I'm going to be looking for your byline now that I've met you in person and I found out that we share this passion. So thank you so much for taking the time to ask me these great questions.
Awesome. Thank you.